A young woman leaves her family to marry a 60-year-old millionaire. 2 years later, in the quaint town of Meadow Grove, a young girl named Emma left her family behind to marry a 60-year-old billionaire, believing it was true love. 2 years later, she returns home, broken and with a secret that will shock everyone. The air in the grand hall was thick with silence, heavy like a storm waiting to break. Emma stood near the carved mahogany table, her hands clenched at her sides. She had rehearsed this moment over and over, yet now that it had come, her voice wavered. "Father, Mother," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I have something to tell you." Martha, her mother, looked up from her embroidery, the silver needle pausing midair. Richard, her father, did not lower his newspaper. The weight of the room pressed against Emma's chest, but she straightened her back. "I'm getting married," she said, forcing the words out before fear could swallow them. Martha gasped, the needle falling from her hand and rolling onto the Persian rug. Richard turned the page of his newspaper without a word. "To whom?" His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something sharp. Emma swallowed hard. "Edward Harrington." This time, the newspaper was lowered. Martha's hand covered her mouth. Her eyes wide with disbelief, Richard's gaze fixed on his daughter, his dark brows knitting together. The moment stretched thin, suffocating before he spoke again. "That businessman? The one old enough to be your father?" "I know his age," Emma said quietly, holding her ground. "But I love him, and he loves me." The room exploded. Richard rose so fast that the chair scraped against the marble floor, the newspaper crumpled in his grip. "Have you lost your mind, Emma?" His voice thundered through the hall, shaking the crystal chandeliers. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? What this will mean for our family?" Martha stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Emma, my love, think this through. Marriage is not just about love. Edward is a powerful man, yes, but his reputation—" She trailed off, pain written across her face. Emma's chest tightened. She had expected resistance, but not like this. Not this anger, not this disbelief. "His reputation is just rumors, Mother. Rumors," Richard scoffed. "You are the daughter of a man who has dedicated his life to faith and integrity. And now you wish to align yourself with a man like him." "He is not what people say he is," Emma retorted. "He treats me with respect, with kindness. Richard's fist slammed onto the table, making Martha flinch. The silence that followed was heavier than the argument itself. Then, in a quieter, colder voice, Richard spoke again. "If you step out of this house to be with him, you do not return. Do you understand me, Emma?" The words cut through her like a blade. "Father, no." "You have made your choice," he said, raising his hand. "Now live with it." Martha's sobs filled the air, her hands clutching at Emma's arms. "Don't do this," she whispered. "Please, Emma, don't throw your life away." Emma's heart ached, torn between duty and desire, but she had already made her decision. Tears burned her eyes as she stepped back, pulling away from her mother's grasp. "I have to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned before she could break, before her resolve could crumble under the weight of their grief. As she reached the doorway, her father's voice rang out once more. "If you leave, you are no longer my daughter." Emma stopped, gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. But she did not turn back. With a deep breath, Emma stepped out of the only home she had ever known. The flight to New York felt endless, but when she finally landed, Edward was waiting. He smiled, his arms open, as if she were the missing piece of his world. "My love," he said, kissing her forehead, "you have made the right choice." Emma let herself be pulled into his embrace, seeking comfort in the warmth of his touch. The drive to the estate was smooth. the city lights flickering like scattered diamonds against the night sky. She had imagined this moment, but the reality was far more overwhelming. So many times she had started fresh, leaving the past behind. Yet when the car pulled into the grand estate, a cold wind swept through her. The mansion was breathtaking, its marble pillars gleaming under the moonlight. It was a palace far grander than her family home. But as Emma stepped inside, something was missing. The laughter of her mother, the stern but steady presence of her father, the warmth of home. Edward led her through the halls, showing her the riches she now possessed. But as his voice filled the silence, Emma felt it. That hollow, lingering emptiness. The silk curtains billowed as the morning breeze swept through the grand bedroom. Emma lay still, her gaze fixed on the high ceiling where a crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the marble floors. The bed beneath her was soft, the sheets finer than anything she had known. She was surrounded by wealth, by beauty, by everything Edward had promised. Yet deep within, something felt hollow. Edward adored her. In their first months together, he showered her with gifts dresses from Paris, diamonds that sparkled under New York's sun, perfumes that lingered long after she left a room. He took her to the finest restaurants where waiters bowed and addressed her as Madame Harrington. He introduced her to powerful men and elegant women, all raising their glasses to celebrate his newest prize, his young, beautiful wife. For a time, Emma allowed herself to be swept away. She laughed at Edward's jokes, smiled for the flashing cameras, and let herself believe that she had found happiness. She silenced the ache for her mother's touch, the longing for her father's approval. But then came the whispers. At first they were faint, slipping through the clinking of wine glasses and hushed conversations at parties. She's just a gold digger, they said. A girl like her, so young, so naive. What else could she want from a man like Edward? Emma tried to ignore them, smiling even as the words stung like tiny blades. She told herself it didn't matter that they didn't know the love she and Edward shared. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They followed her like a shadow, casting a pall over her new life. One evening, as they attended a gala, Emma overheard a group of women talking. "Did you see her?" one of them said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She's barely out of her teens, and he's old enough to be her grandfather. It's disgusting." Emma's heart sank. She looked around the room, seeing the judgment in the eyes of the guests. Suddenly, the grandeur of the mansion felt oppressive. The wealth and beauty, nothing more than a gilded cage. She excused herself, retreating to the balcony for some fresh air. The night was cool, the stars above distant and unreachable. Emma leaned against the railing, her eyes filling with tears. She had thought she could find happiness here, but the whispers and judgments were too much to bear. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. Turning, she saw Edward, his eyes filled with concern. "Emma, what's wrong?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Edward, I can't do this anymore. The whispers, the judgments, they're too much. I thought I could ignore them, but I can't." Edward's expression softened. "Emma, I'm sorry. I should have protected you from all this, but please, don't let them drive you away. We can face this together." Emma looked into his eyes, seeing the love and sincerity there. But she also saw the reality of their situation, the age difference, the societal expectations, the constant scrutiny. It was too much. "I'm sorry, Edward," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to go home." Edward's grip on her shoulder tightened briefly, then relaxed. He nodded, a sad smile on his lips. "I understand. I'll arrange for your flight back to Meadow Grove." Emma turned away, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She had come here seeking love and happiness, but she had found only emptiness and judgment. It was time to return to the warmth and familiarity of home, even if it meant facing the disapproval of her family. As she packed her bags, she couldn't shake the feeling of failure, but she also felt a glimmer of hope, the hope that perhaps she could find a way to heal and move forward, surrounded by the love of her family. Emma and Edward shared a love, but the whispers lingered, creeping into her thoughts in the quiet moments when she was alone in their vast, empty home. And then there were the looks, the fleeting glances of judgment, the smirks hidden behind crystal glasses. No matter how many jewels Edward draped over her, she could not change how they saw her. "You shouldn't care what people think," Edward told her one night, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "People will always talk. They envy what they don't have." Emma nodded, but a part of her wondered, what if they were right? The first time she noticed Edward's control, it was subtle. "That dress is too bright," he said one evening as she stood before the mirror in a scarlet gown. "Something softer would suit you better." It was not a demand, not quite, but when she reached for a pale blue dress instead, he smiled and kissed her forehead. Then it happened again. "You don't need to go out so often, my love. Everything you need is here." At first it felt like care, a loving husband, protecting his wife from a world that could be cruel. But soon it became more. When she wanted to visit the old bookstore in the city, Edward insisted it wasn't safe. When she mentioned meeting an old school friend, he frowned and changed the subject. "Not everyone is worth your time, Emma. You belong to a different world now." She told herself it was love, that he only wanted what was best for her, until the night he told her to stop speaking to Amelia. They were sitting in the grand dining room, the long table between them empty but for their untouched plates. Edward's voice was calm but firm. "I don't want you talking to her anymore." Emma blinked. "Why?" "She fills your head with nonsense. She doesn't understand our life. I won't have her poisoning your thoughts." Emma's fingers tightened around her fork. "She's my best friend." "She was your friend," he corrected, "before you became my wife." A chill ran to her. For the first time, a flicker of fear settled deep within her chest. She had left behind her family, and now, one by one, she was losing everyone else. The morning air was crisp, sunlight spilling through the high windows of the grand estate. Emma stood before her vanity, fastening the clasp of a delicate bracelet Edward had gifted her. Today she was meeting Amelia, a brief escape from the heavy silence that had begun to settle around her life. She had barely reached for her purse when Edward's voice stopped her. "Where are you going?" Emma turned, surprised to see him leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. His tone was soft, almost casual, but there was something beneath it, something firm, immovable. "I told you last night," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm meeting Amelia." He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You won't be going." A strange pressure tightened around her chest. "Why not?" "Because I said so." His voice remained calm, controlled, yet it left no room for argument. "I don't trust the people she surrounds herself with. You don't need to be involved in any of that." Emma stared at him, her fingers tightening around her purse strap. "Amelia is my friend, and I am your wife." A cold silence stretched between them. She could feel the walls of the mansion closing in, the invisible chains wrapping tighter around her. She wanted to argue, to push past him. But something about the way he stood there, the quiet power in his voice, made her hesitate. Without another word, she set the purse down. Edward smiled, stepping forward to kiss her forehead. "Good girl." That night, as the staff cleared away dinner, Enns, the head of security, lingered near the hallway. Edward glanced at him, a silent exchange passing between them. Emma noticed but said nothing, the weight of the day's events still heavy on her mind. As she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and luxury, now felt like a prison. She had come here seeking love and happiness, but she had found only control and isolation. The thought of losing her freedom, her friends, her identity, was too much to bear. She turned to Edward, who was already asleep beside her, his breathing steady and calm. She watched him for a moment. The man she had once believed would bring her happiness. But now she saw him for what he was, a man who sought to control her, to mold her into his perfect wife. With a heavy heart, she made her decision. She would leave, return to Meadow Grove, and face whatever awaited her there. She would not let herself be trapped in this gilded cage any longer. The next morning, she woke early, packing a small bag with only the essentials. She left a note for Edward on the bedside table, her hand trembling as she wrote the words. "Edward, I can't stay here any longer. I need to find my own path, my own happiness. Please don't try to find me. Goodbye." She slipped out of the mansion, the early morning light casting long shadows across the grounds. The drive to the airport was quiet, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She had left her family once, believing she had found true love. Now she was returning, broken and uncertain, but determined to find her own way. As the plane took off, she looked out the window, watching the grand estate grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared from view. She took a deep breath, a mix of fear and relief washing over her. She was leaving behind the wealth, the luxury, the control, and stepping into the unknown. But she was also stepping into freedom, into the chance to find her true self. And with that thought, she closed her eyes, ready to face whatever came next. Inns was a man of few words, always professional, never speaking unless necessary. But tonight he hesitated. Emma noticed. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Inns glanced over his shoulder as if ensuring they were alone. His voice was low when he spoke. "Madam, be careful." Emma's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" He hesitated again and took a step closer. "Edward is not the man you think he is." Emma frowned. "If you have something to say it," Inns exhaled. "There are things about his past, things you don't know. You should be cautious." A chill ran through her. She had lived under this roof for months. She had seen the whispers at parties, the tension in Edward's shoulders when certain names were mentioned, but she had ignored it. Now she wasn't sure she could. Emma began to notice the calls late at night when the house was quiet. Edward would slip into his office, his voice low, words clipped. When she entered a room, he would turn his phone over, change the subject, end conversations abruptly. She told herself it was business, but the doubt had taken root. One evening, as she passed his study, she heard him speaking in hushed tones. She paused. "She suspects nothing," his voice smooth, measured. "She is young, obedient. This was the right move. Her family name alone is enough to shield me. No one will question me now." A pause. "Of course, she means nothing." The words crashed over her like a wave. Emma pressed a hand to the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. It had all been a lie. Edward had never loved her. She was nothing more than a pawn, a tool to clean his reputation, to tie himself to her father's influence. Her hands trembled. She wanted to storm into the room, to demand the truth, to scream, but she couldn't move. She turned and walked away, her world unraveling with every step. That night she searched for answers, but there was nothing. No past business scandals, no rumors that hadn't been erased, no history beyond what Edward had chosen to reveal. It was as if he had carefully constructed every piece of his identity, every detail a polished lie. Emma sat in the dark. the glow of the screen illuminating her shaking hands. She had walked away from her family for this man, and now she didn't know who he was at all. Emma stood in the grand sitting room, her hands clenched at her sides. The glow of the chandeliers cast long shadows across the walls, but the warmth of the light did nothing to soften the coldness in her chest. Edward sat in his leather chair, legs crossed, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He did not look surprised by her outburst. In fact, he looked amused. "Say it again," he said, tilting his head. Emma's voice did not waver. "You never loved me. This marriage was never real." A slow smirk formed on Edward's lips. He took a sip of his drink before setting the glass down. "And you only realize this now?" Her heart twisted. "So it's true," she whispered. He gestured to the room around them, to the wealth, the luxury, the pristine image of a powerful man with his young, devoted wife. "You are always a means to an end, my dear. A perfect picture for the public. A daughter of a respected man giving me the credibility I needed. Did you think this was love?" The words hit her harder than she had expected. A part of her had held on to hope, to the illusion that there was at least some part of him that had cared. But now she saw the truth, cold, harsh, and unyielding. Emma took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I won't stay here any longer. I won't be a part of your lies." Edward's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You think you can just leave? You think it's that simple?" She met his gaze steadily. "I don't care what you think. I'm leaving, and you can't stop me." He stood up, his voice sharp. "You're making a mistake, Emma. You have no idea what you're walking away from." "I know exactly what I'm walking away from," she retorted. "A life of lies and manipulation. I won't be your pawn anymore." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, her steps firm and determined. She had come here seeking love and happiness, but she had found only deceit. It was time to return home, to face the truth, and to find her own path. As she packed her bags, she felt a mix of fear and relief. She was leaving behind the luxury and comfort of the mansion, but she was also leaving behind the control and the lies. She was stepping into the unknown, but she was also stepping into freedom. The next morning, she left the estate without looking back. The drive to the airport was quiet, her mind filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. She had made mistakes, trusted the wrong people, but she was determined to learn from them and to find her own strength. As the plane took off, she looked out the window, watching the grand estate disappear from view. She took a deep breath, a sense of peace washing over her. She was going home, not as the broken girl she had been, but as a woman ready to face her past and to build her future. "You've been a fool, Emma." Edward leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "But don't look so sad. You got what you wanted too, didn't you? A life of luxury, security. Do you really want to throw all of this away?" Emma lifted her chin. "I'd rather have nothing than live a life built on lies." Edward exhaled, shaking his head. "You're being dramatic." "No," she said firmly. "I'm finally seeing things clearly." She turned and walked out of the room, her heart pounding, her mind already racing toward what had to come next. She had to leave that night. Emma went to Inns. "You must help me," she said in a hushed voice. "I need to leave." Inns's eyes flickered with concern. "It's not safe. He watches everything." "I don't care. I can't stay here any longer." For a moment, Inns hesitated. Then he nodded. "We must be careful. He cannot know until it is too late." Together they planned. Emma packed only what she needed: documents, cash, a few personal belongings. She would slip out in the night, take the back roads, and disappear before Edward could stop her. But they underestimated him. He knew. Edward stood in the doorway as Emma zipped the small suitcase and Inns followed her. She froze, the color draining from her face. He did not look angry. Somehow that made it worse. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice calm. Emma's throat tightened. She didn't bother lying. He stepped forward, hands in his pockets, regarding her with an unsettling patience. "Tell me, Emma, what do you think happens after you leave?" She steadied herself. "I don't care." Edward chuckled, shaking his head. "Ah, but you should." He leaned in, his voice dropping lower. "Because after you're gone, I'll tell the world that you ran off with your lover. Inns, perhaps, or maybe some man no one has met before. The daughter of the great Richard abandoning her marriage, her family honor." Emma's breath caught. "They'll believe me," he continued smoothly. "And your father? He will never recover from the shame. He will disown you completely. Your mother," he sighed almost mockingly. "She will be heartbroken." Emma felt her pulse hammering in her ears. "You wouldn't." "Wouldn't I?" He smiled, taking the suitcase from her hands with ease. "Be a good wife, Emma. Accept your place." She wanted to scream, to fight, but she knew it would do no good. The next day, Inns was kicked out of the mansion, making Emma feel extremely guilty. As the days passed, the walls of the mansion closed tighter around her. Edward restricted her movements, guards watched her closely, and the staff kept their distance, fearful of his wrath. Emma felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She had tried to escape, to find her freedom, but she had failed. Now she was more trapped than ever, her every move scrutinized, her every thought shadowed by fear. She spent her days in a haze, going through the motions of her gilded cage life. The grandeur of the mansion felt oppressive, the luxury a mockery of her true situation. She longed for the warmth of her family home, for the love and support of her parents, but she knew that bridge had been burned. One evening, as she sat in the grand sitting room, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames of the fireplace, she made a silent vow. She would not let herself be broken. She would find a way out no matter what it took. She would reclaim her life, her identity, and her freedom. With renewed determination, she began to observe, to plan. She noted the guards' routines, the staff's schedules, and Edward's habits. She started to gather information, to look for weaknesses in the security, to find allies among the staff who might be sympathetic to her plight. It was a slow and careful process, but she was patient. She knew that one wrong move could ruin everything. She had to be smart, to be cunning, to be the woman she never thought she could be. And so Emma began her quiet rebellion, her silent fight for freedom. She would not be a pawn in Edward's game any longer. She would not be a trophy wife, a symbol of his power and control. She would be Emma, strong, resilient, and free. Emma was trapped, but she was not broken. She watched, she waited. She pretended to obey, nodding when Edward spoke, lowering her gaze in submission. But inside, she burned. If she could not escape yet, she would prepare. Emma had learned patience. She had no choice. Days passed in the suffocating silence of the estate, and she moved carefully, speaking only when necessary and never raising suspicion. If she was going to bring Edward down, she had to be smart. Amelia was the only person she could trust. Late at night, when she was sure the staff had retreated and the security cameras in her room had nothing to see but the flicker of a bedside lamp, she would whisper to Amelia over the phone. "He talks about business freely now," Emma said. "Good," Amelia replied. "Keep him talking. He thinks you've given up, and that's your advantage." Emma played her role well. She listened with feigned curiosity, asking innocent questions. Edward, pleased with her sudden interest in his world, indulged her. "You should understand these things, my love," he said one evening, swirling his glass of wine. "One day, this will all be yours." Emma smiled, nodding as though she believed him. But in her pocket, her phone was recording. Each night when Edward slept, she searched his office. She had memorized the way his desk drawers creaked, the pattern of passwords he used, and slowly, piece by piece, she found what she was looking for: documents, bank records, emails linking him to offshore accounts, transactions that should not exist. The picture was clear: money laundering, tax evasion, illegal dealings buried under layers of deception. Then one evening, Edward came home furious. "There's a traitor," he seethed, pacing the room. "Someone has been leaking information. If I find out who it is," he exhaled sharply, "they'll regret it." Emma kept her face neutral, her fingers tightening around the phone hidden in her sleeve. "What will you do?" she asked softly. Edward didn't hesitate. "Handle it the way I always do." His meaning was clear. Emma pressed record. An opportunity presented itself days later. The annual Feast of Sacrifice was approaching. "I need to go home," she told Edward. "To Abu Dhabi. My family expects me to be there." Edward studied her, his fingers tapping against the arm of his chair. "And why would I allow that?" "Because they will question he had just returned to the estate when the first call came. Then the second. By the third, his hands were shaking. The government was involved, the banks were cooperating, and the police had enough to summon him for questioning. If they pressed further, he would lose everything. Without hesitation, he began packing. By nightfall, his private jet was scheduled for takeoff, destination France. But as he stuffed papers into his briefcase, his phone vibrated. The TV in the corner of the room flickered on. There on the screen was the headline: "Billionaire businessman Edward Harrington under investigation for financial crimes." And below it, a photo of Emma. She was standing outside the police station, her eyes clear and unafraid. For the first time in his life, Edward felt something unfamiliar: fear. Emma had won the first battle, and she was just getting started. Emma stood before the heavy wooden door, her breath unsteady, her hands trembling. The house loomed over her, unchanged yet unfamiliar. It had been months since she last walked through these gates. Now, standing here, she felt like a stranger. The air was thick with hesitation, her mind waging war against itself. Would they turn her away? Would her father even look at her? She reached out, fingers brushing against the iron handle, then hesitated. A part of her wanted to leave, to turn back before she had to face their judgment. But she had nowhere else to go. With a deep breath, she knocked. The sound echoed through the still night. For a moment, nothing, then slow, measured footsteps from within. The door creaked open. Martha stood there, her eyes wide, lips parted in shock. For a long moment, neither spoke. Emma's chest ached. Her mother's face, so familiar, was lined with worry and pain, a pain Emma knew she had caused. The warmth of home was right in front of her, yet there was a distance in Martha's eyes. "Mama," Emma whispered. Martha's lips quivered, but she did not step forward. Instead, her gaze searched Emma's face, lingering on the dark circles beneath her eyes, the exhaustion in her stance. "Emma," she said, the name barely leaving her lips. It was neither an embrace nor a rejection, just a name spoken with the weight of all the months that had passed. Behind her, deep within the house, came a familiar voice. "Who is it, Martha?" Richard called out. Martha hesitated. Then in a quiet voice she answered, "It's her." A long silence followed. Then from the living room the voice came again, calm and measured. "Let her in if she wishes to enter." The words were not warm. They were not an invitation. But they were not a refusal either. Martha stepped aside, the door opening wider. "Come in, Emma," she said softly. It's cold outside. The house smelled the same, sandalwood, old books, the faint scent of jasmine tea. The air inside was warmer than the night air, but Emma still felt cold. She followed her mother into the living room, her heart pounding with each step. Her father sat in his usual chair, a book resting open in his lap. He did not look at her as she entered. The only sign that he acknowledged her presence was the way he slowly closed the book, setting it aside. The silence stretched. Then finally he spoke. "Why are you here now?" The words were quiet, without the fire of the last time they had spoken. No anger, no shouting, just something far worse. Disappointment. Emma swallowed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Baba," she began, her voice cracking. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she had to say. "Made mistakes. I know I hurt you both. But I need your help. I need to come home." Richard finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a mix of emotions in his gaze, pain, anger, but also a glimmer of something else, something softer. "And why should we help you, Emma?" he asked, his voice steady. "After everything that has happened?" Emma took a step forward, her voice filled with sincerity. "Because I'm your daughter, because I need you, and because I'm ready to make things right." Martha, who had been standing silently by the door, moved closer, her hand resting gently on Emma's shoulder. "Richard," she said softly, "she's here. That's a start." Richard looked at his wife, then back at Emma. The silence stretched again, but this time it was filled with a different kind of tension, a tension of hope, of possibility. Finally, Richard nodded. "You can stay," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "But there will be rules. You will respect this house and the people in it. You will work to earn back our trust, and you will tell us everything." Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you, Baba," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I promise I will make things right." And so Emma began her journey back home. Back to her family, back to herself. It would not be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But she was determined. She would face whatever came her way, with her family by her side. "I was wrong," Richard exhaled, still not looking at her. Emma stepped forward, her eyes burning. "I have nowhere else to go." At that, his gaze lifted. His dark eyes studied her, unreadable. "Nowhere else," he repeated. "So now you remember. You have a home." The word stung. "I never forgot," Emma whispered. "I was afraid that you would never forgive me." Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. The exhaustion in his face was clear. "Forgiveness is not the issue, Emma," he said. "The issue is whether you have learned anything at all." Emma's chest tightened. "I have," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I thought I was choosing love. I thought I knew what I wanted, but I was blind. I lost everything, and I don't expect things to go back to how they were. I just want to come home." A heavy silence filled the room. Richard watched her for a long moment, then finally he sighed. "You cannot undo what has been done," he said, "and I will not pretend that nothing has happened." Emma lowered her head, but he continued, his voice softer. "It is late, and your mother is right. It is cold outside." Emma looked up just as Martha stepped forward and at last reached for her hand. It was not a full embrace, not yet, but it was enough. And for now, that was all she needed. The scent of freshly ground coffee beans filled the air, mingling with the faint trace of old wood and sun-warmed fabric. Emma stood in the middle of the small, empty space, her fingers brushing against the worn countertop. The walls were faded, the floors uneven, and dust clung stubbornly to the window panes. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of control over her own life. Amelia had been the first to encourage her. "You need something of your own, Emma," she had said. "Something no one can take from you." Emma nodded, unsure at first. But then the idea began to take shape slowly, like dawn creeping over the desert. A cafe. A place where people could pause, breathe, and feel at home, even if only for a little while. It had taken weeks of searching, but then she had found it, a small, neglected building tucked away on a quiet street. It wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, but it had potential. Hayat Jadida, she whispered to herself, testing the name. A new life. The first days were grueling. The walls needed repainting, the floors needed repairing, and the furniture, what little she could afford, had to be scrubbed and arranged. Every morning, she tied back her hair, rolled up her sleeves, and worked until her arms ached. Amelia was there, of course, always showing up with tea and encouragement. "You've never run a business before," Amelia teased one afternoon, handing Emma a steaming cup. "What makes you think you can now?" Emma smiled, exhaustion tugging at her features. "I don't know, but I have to try." And so she did. She studied coffee blends, watched tutorials on brewing techniques, and practiced frothing milk until her hands grew steady. Some nights she lay awake wondering if she had made a mistake. But then she would think of the life she had left behind. The cold, empty halls of Edward's mansion, the suffocating weight of control, and she knew there was no turning back. Then one morning an unexpected delivery arrived. Emma stepped outside to find an old pickup truck parked in front of the cafe. Two men unloaded wooden tables and chairs, their edges worn smooth with time. She frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "Excuse me. There must be a mistake," she said. "No mistake, miss," one of the men interrupted. "Your father sent these—" Emma stood frozen. She hadn't spoken to Richard since the day she left Edward. Their last conversation had been nothing but silence, his disappointment heavy in the space between them. And yet, here was his unspoken acknowledgement. His quiet way of showing her that he saw her, that he understood. She swallowed past the lump in her throat and nodded. "Thank you." The cafe opened on a crisp morning, the air carrying the scent of fresh pastries and spiced coffee. Emma stood behind the counter, smoothing her apron, her heart pounding harder than she cared to admit. Amelia was the first to arrive, grinning as she held up her phone. "I told everyone," she said. "They're all coming." Emma's eyes widened. "Everyone?" Amelia laughed. "Well, not everyone, but enough to make this place feel alive." And it did. Throughout the day, people trickled in, friends, neighbors, even a few strangers drawn by the inviting aroma. Emma greeted each one with a warm smile, her hands steady as she poured coffees and served pastries. The cafe buzzed with conversation and laughter, the atmosphere cozy and inviting. As the day wore on, Emma felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had done this. She had created a space where people could come together, where they could find a moment of peace and warmth. It was more than just a cafe. It was a testament to her resilience, her determination to rebuild her life on her own terms. And as she looked around at the smiling faces, she knew that this was just the beginning. She had a long way to go, but she was on the right path. She was home, and she was finally truly free. "I know you're going to be busy," Amelia had said, and she was right. The neighbors came, curious faces peeking in, a young couple, a woman carrying a stack of books, an elderly man who sat by the window staring out at the street as if lost in thought. And then as the morning sun streamed through the door, she saw them. Martha entered first, her gaze sweeping over the cafe before settling on Emma. There was warmth there, something close to pride. Then behind her, moving with the quiet authority he had always carried, was Richard. He did not say a word. He simply took a seat in the far corner, unfolded his newspaper, and began to read. Emma exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had built this place from nothing, carved out a life on her own terms, and now, as she turned to pour the first cup of coffee, she knew this was just the beginning. The morning light streamed through the cafe windows, casting long shadows over the wooden floor. Emma wiped the counter with slow, deliberate strokes, her mind at peace in a way it hadn't been for a long time. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of conversation. The world outside bustled, but inside there was a comforting stillness. Then the door burst open. Amelia rushed in, her breath unsteady, her dark eyes filled with something unreadable. In her hands was a folded newspaper, clenched so tightly the pages crinkled. "Emma," she gasped, striding toward the counter. "You need to see this." Emma frowned, taking the paper. It was already warm from Amelia's grip. With a slow, measured breath, she unfolded it. And there, splashed across the front page in bold letters, was Edward's name. "Interpol arrests Edward Harrington in major financial scandal." The words swam before her eyes. She scanned the article, absorbing the details: fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. Edward had been arrested and was being extradited to New York. The man who had once controlled everything, who had spoken with such authority, who had threatened and manipulated without fear of consequence, was now reduced to a criminal in custody, shackled like any other lawbreaker. Amelia was watching her carefully. "What do you feel?" she asked. Emma placed the paper on the counter, smoothing it with her fingers. Her heart was steady. There was no fear, no regret. "Nothing." "Nothing," she said. And it was the truth. Amelia exhaled, nodding. "Good. It's over now." "Yes," Emma agreed. "It's over." That afternoon, a man in a crisp gray suit entered the cafe. His presence stood out immediately, too polished and too deliberate, like he was carrying something heavy that didn't belong in a place like this. Emma recognized him before he spoke. "Miss Emma Harrington?" he asked. She nodded, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You must be Edward's attorney." He confirmed with a nod, setting a small envelope on the counter. "Before he was taken, he asked me to give you this." Emma stared at the envelope. It was unassuming, plain white with her name written in a hand she knew well. She didn't reach for it. "What does it say?" The attorney hesitated. "I didn't read it, but if I may speak freely." He paused and then continued. "I have worked with Edward for years. He was not a man prone to regret, but I believe in the end he regretted something about you." Emma exhaled slowly. "Thank you for bringing it, but I don't need it." The attorney studied her, then gave a small nod. He left the envelope on the counter and walked away. For a long time, Emma didn't move. Then, without a word, she picked up the letter and stepped onto the cafe's small balcony. The city stretched before her, alive and relentless. Cars wove through the streets. People hurried along sidewalks, the pulse of the city unchanged by the downfall of one man. She broke the seal and unfolded the paper. "Emma, I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. But you were the only one who was ever real in my life. Perhaps if I had been a better man, things would have been different. I wish you well. Edward." She read it twice, waiting for something: anger, sadness, even satisfaction. But all she felt was emptiness. Edward was a shadow of the past, a man who had controlled her life but never truly owned her heart. She held the letter over the balcony railing and let the flame from her lighter kiss its edge. The paper curled, blackened, and disintegrated into nothing. The ashes scattered into the wind, disappearing into the city below. It was done. Back inside, the cafe was alive with chatter. The line of customers stretched to the door, the scent of cinnamon and coffee filling the air. Emma stepped behind the counter, rolling up her sleeves. Amelia caught her eye, smiling. "How do you feel now?" she asked. Emma picked up a tray of fresh cups, turning to the waiting customers. "Like myself again," she said. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Emma moved behind the counter, her hands steady, her heart light. The soft hum of conversation wove through the cozy space of Hayat Jadida, mingling with the occasional clink of porcelain cups and the gentle laughter of customers. This place had become more than just a cafe. It was a refuge, a second chance. She glanced toward the corner where an elderly man sat, his newspaper open, but his eyes watchful. Richard did not speak much when he visited, but his presence alone said more than words ever could. Once she had feared his disappointment, his silence. Now she understood. He was there, and that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Emma found her rhythm. The cafe thrived, becoming a beloved spot in the community. She hired more staff, expanded the menu, and even started hosting small events, poetry nights, book clubs, and art exhibitions. Each day brought new challenges, new joys, and new connections. One evening, as she was closing up, she found Martha sitting at the counter, a cup of tea in her hands. Emma smiled, taking a seat beside her. "Long day?" Martha asked, her voice soft. Emma nodded. "But a good one." Martha reached out, her hand covering Emma's. "I'm proud of you, Emma. You've built something beautiful here." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you, Mama. I couldn't have done it without you and Baba." Martha smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We're here for you, always, no matter what." And in that moment, Emma knew she was home. She had found her place, her purpose, and her peace. The journey had been long and painful, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. As she looked around the cafe, her heart swelled with gratitude and love. This was her new life, her new beginning, and she was ready to embrace every moment of it. He had refused to acknowledge her. Now he came often, sipping his tea, observing. It was his way of telling her that, despite everything, she was still his daughter. Across the room, Martha wiped down a table, pausing briefly to chat with a regular customer. Emma watched as her mother smiled, genuinely smiled, something she had not done in years. They were healing, slowly. It had not been easy. When she first opened Hayat Jadida, there were moments of doubt, days when exhaustion weighed heavy on her. But she had refused to crumble. She had built something with her own hands, something that did not depend on anyone else's approval or wealth. Now the cafe thrived. People came not just for the coffee, but for the warmth, for the sense of belonging. There were students hunched over textbooks, old friends catching up, tired workers seeking a quiet moment. And there was Zaid, the stray cat that had claimed the cafe as his home, lounging lazily by the window, accepting affection only on his terms. Emma had found comfort in simple things, the rhythm of the morning rush, the quiet lull of the afternoons, the way the setting sun cast golden hues over the cafe's name. Hayat Jadida. New life, and in many ways it was. One afternoon, a young man approached her as she arranged fresh flowers by the register. "Miss Emma?" She turned, offering a polite smile. "Yes?" He extended a business card. "I'm Sammy Darwish. I've been following your cafe's success, and I believe there's potential to expand, perhaps even open another location." Emma took the card but did not answer right away. A year ago, she might have leaped at the opportunity, eager to prove herself, to chase bigger dreams. But she was no longer the same woman. "I appreciate the offer," she said, meeting his gaze. "But I don't make decisions in a hurry anymore. I'll think about it." Sammy nodded, seemingly impressed. Take your time. Success should grow naturally. As he left, Emma glanced at her mother, who had been listening from nearby. You handled that well, Martha remarked. Emma smiled. I've learned a few things. She had learned patience, strength, the importance of knowing what truly mattered. That evening, as the last customers trickled out, Emma stepped outside. The sky was painted in deep orange and soft lavender, the warmth of the sun fading into the cool embrace of night. She looked up at the sign, Hayat Jadida, glowing softly in the twilight. A year ago, she had walked away from a life of gold and illusions. She had been lost, broken. Now she stood firm, whole. A quiet purr drew her attention downward. Zaid, the cafe's self-proclaimed guardian, curled around her feet, his emerald eyes blinking lazily. Emma bent down, running a gentle hand along his fur. We made it, didn't we? She whispered. The cat flicked his tail, unimpressed, before sauntering back inside. Emma laughed softly, straightened, and took a deep breath. The journey had been long and challenging, but she had found her way. She had found her new life, her Hayat Jadida, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. She had found her way, and for the first time in a long, long time, she was truly happy. And that, my friends, is the story of Emma. A tale of resilience, redemption, and the power of starting over. She walked away from a life built on illusions and found something far greater, herself. No longer defined by wealth, expectations, or the whispers of others, she created a place where people could find warmth and belonging. But now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to rebuild your life from scratch? Have you ever found strength in places you never expected? Let's talk about it in the comments. I read every single one. And hey, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story like this. There's always more to come, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, take care, stay strong, and remember, sometimes the best stories start at the end of something else.